The Persian soldiers expected gold. What they found instead made even these battle-hardened warriors step back in horror. It was October 539 BCE. Babylon had just fallen. While the city burned above, a squad of treasure hunters descended into the forgotten chambers beneath the Temple of Marduk. Their torches flickered against ancient stone as they pushed through centuries of dust and debris. "Sir, over here." The youngest soldier's voice cracked. He'd been digging through what looked like a refuse pit, broken pottery, rotted wood, the detritus of a dying empire. But his spade had struck something else. Bones. Small bones. Too small. The captain pushed forward, and that's when they saw it clearly. A skeleton, unmistakably that of a child, buried among shattered idols and animal remains. But it was what surrounded the bones that made their blood run cold. Clay tablets, dozens of them, scattered like leaves around the small body. The captain lifted one with trembling hands. The cuneiform was crude, hastily carved, but the message was clear: he is beneath. Another tablet: do not wake what sleeps below. And another: the 13th moon brings his return. The soldiers exchanged glances. They'd come for Babylonian treasure. Instead, they'd uncovered something the greatest empire on earth had tried desperately to hide. Something so terrible that priests had buried it in secret, surrounding it with warnings. But this story doesn't start here, in the ruins. It starts 13 years earlier, with a boy who just wanted to make his mother proud. How did a boy end up buried in secret beneath Babylon's holiest temple? What terror was so great that an empire tried to erase its memory? The answer lies in one of history's darkest chapters, a ritual so horrifying that those who survived it chose madness over memory. The morning they came for him, birds stopped singing in the courtyard, as if nature itself knew what was coming. His name was Shamash-Iddi, 13 years old, and until that morning, his biggest worry had been whether his father would let him help at the market stall. He was grinding barley with his younger sister when the temple delegation arrived. 3 priests in white robes, 2 temple guards, and behind them, the selector, a woman whose eyes had seen too many boys taken, too many mothers weep. "We seek the one marked by heaven," she announced, though everyone knew what that meant. Virgin boys, pure, untouched by the world's corruption. The temple always needed them for sacred purposes. His mother appeared in the doorway, and the color drained from her face. Shamash-Iddi would never forget that look, the moment a mother realizes she's about to lose her child forever. "Not my son," she whispered, then louder, "Please, not my son." But the priests had ways of finding what they wanted. The selector moved through their small house like a hunting cat, examining each child. She passed over his sister, too young. His older brother, recently married, was ignored. Then her eyes fell on Shamash-Iddi. "This one," she said simply. What happened next was chaos. His mother threw herself between them, begging, offering everything they had. His father tried reason, then bribes, then threats. But the temple's word was absolute in Babylon. "You should be honored," the head priest said, though his voice held no warmth. "Your son will serve the gods themselves." Shamash-Iddi watched his mother collapse as the guards stepped forward. She grabbed his ankles, and for one moment he thought maybe her love could save him. But strong hands pulled him away, and his mother's scream would be the last sound of love he'd ever hear. They dressed it up with pretty words: chosen, blessed, sacred duty. But Shamash-Iddi had heard the whispers. Boys chosen for the temple's inner rituals didn't come back. Oh, sometimes their families received word that their son had ascended to divine service. But the boys themselves? Never seen again. As they marched him through Babylon's streets, citizens averted their eyes. Everyone knew, but no one spoke. The temple's power was absolute, its secrets darker than the river at night. Shamash-Iddi tried to memorize everything: the smell of bread from the bakeries, the sound of merchants haggling, the feel of sun on his skin. Somehow, he sensed these simple pleasures were ending forever. They passed through the market where his friend Enlil worked. Their eyes met for an instant before Enlil's father yanked him back inside their stall. The message was clear: forget you knew him. What waited for him in the temple was worse than death. Death, at least, was comprehensible. What the temple did to virgin boys existed in whispers and nightmares, in the broken mumblings of priests who drank too much beer and spoke of things that shouldn't exist. The selector walked ahead, her copper bells ringing with each step. Those bells mothers across Babylon knew their sound. They meant another child taken, another family destroyed, another sacrifice to gods whose hunger never seemed satisfied. "Where are we going?" Shamash, Idi finally asked. The selector didn't turn. "To serve your purpose." "What purpose?" Now she did look back, and for just a moment, he saw something almost like pity in her ancient eyes. "The purpose you were born for, child. The reason heaven marked you." They were approaching the temple complex now, its ziggurat rising like a mountain of mud brick and ambition. Shamash Idi had been here before. Of course, every citizen came for the public festivals. But they were heading toward a different entrance, one he'd never noticed. Smaller, darker, guards posted, who wore no insignia. The other boys who'd been taken, where were they? In 3 years of selections, 12 boys had entered these doors. Not one had been seen again. Their families received compensation, threats to stay quiet, and nothing more. The guards stepped aside. The small door opened like a mouth. As the temple gates closed behind him, he had no idea that within these walls, 12 boys before him had already learned the true meaning of sacred horror. The smell hit him first frankincense so thick it choked, mixed with something else, something that smelled like fear itself. The passage beyond the door was narrow, lit only by oil lamps that threw dancing shadows on walls covered in prayers he couldn't read. The selector led him deeper, down stairs that seemed to descend forever, into parts of the temple the public never imagined existed. "Wait here," she commanded, leaving him in a small chamber. That's when he heard them. Voices, young voices, singing no, not singing, chanting, the same words, over and over, in a language that predated even ancient Sumerian. The sound made his skin crawl. A door opened, and another boy appeared, maybe 14, but his eyes looked decades older. His head was shaved, his body draped in a rough brown robe that couldn't quite hide how thin he'd become. "New one?" the boy asked. His voice was hoarse, like he'd been screaming, or hadn't spoken in days. Shamash Idi nodded, unable to find words. "I'm Marduk Nasir." Was. "They don't like us using names here." He glanced nervously at the doorway. "Come, they'll want you cleaned first." "Cleaned?" "Purified. That's what they call it." Marduk Nasir led him through a maze of corridors. "Everything you were before. Forget it. It doesn't matter now." They passed chambers where other boys sat in absolute silence, staring at walls covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. One rocked back and forth, clutching something to his chest. Another traced patterns in the air with trembling fingers. That's when he noticed the scratches on the walls. At first, they looked like random marks. Then he realized fingernails. Desperate fingernails trying to claw through solid stone. "Don't stare," Marduk Nasir whispered. "And whatever you do, don't ask about the ones who aren't here anymore." They entered a larger chamber where 6 other boys sat in a circle. All bore the same hollow-eyed look, the same unnatural thinness. All wore identical brown robes. All had red cords tied around their waists. "Brothers," Marduk Nasir announced, "we have another." The boys looked up with a mixture of pity and relief for Shamash Idi, relief that fresh blood meant the priest's attention might shift away from them, if only briefly. An older priest entered, his face hidden behind a bronze mask shaped like a bird of prey. The boys immediately prostrated themselves. Shamash Idi, confused, remained standing. The priest's head tilted, studying, evaluating. "You will learn," the voice behind the mask said. It sounded like grinding stone. "They all learn." The boy who warned him disappeared that very night. Marduk Nasir, who'd shown just a trace of kindness, simply vanished between evening prayers and morning rituals. When Shamash Idi asked where he'd gone, the other boys acted like they'd never heard the name. "There are only 8 chosen," one boy said mechanically. "There have always been only 8 chosen." But Shamash Idi had counted 9 boys the night before. He was certain. The purification began immediately. They stripped him, burned his clothes, shaved every hair from his body. The water they bathed him in smelled of lotus and something metallic blood, he realized later. Old blood mixed with sacred oils. They took his name next. "You are not Shamash Idi," the masked priest intoned. "You are the vessel, empty, waiting to be filled with divine purpose. Hours of chanting followed. The words were hypnotic, designed to break down the mind's defenses. Several boys chanted along perfectly, their voices empty of emotion or thought. Others mumbled, struggling to keep up. One boy in the corner didn't chant at all. He just smiled at something no one else could see. The red cord they tied around his waist would never come off. "This binds you to your purpose," the priest explained. "Remove it, and the gods will know. The punishment for such sacrilege is creative." As night fell, though down here, day and night lost meaning, they were led to sleeping chambers, stone slabs with thin mats, no windows, no hope of escape. The boy next to Shamash-Idi whispered in the darkness, "Tomorrow begins the real preparation. Today was just to see if you'd break immediately." "What happens tomorrow?" The boy's laugh was hollow. "Tomorrow, they start making us ready, pure, worthy." His voice dropped even lower. "Tomorrow, they begin turning us into what the ritual requires. Tomorrow," they said, his true purpose would begin. But first, he had to survive what they called the preparation. They started with his name. By dawn, he'd forgotten he ever had one. The systematic destruction of identity began in the deep hours before sunrise. Priests in bronze masks woke them with copper bells, the sound drilling into their skulls. No gentle awakening, no moment to remember dreams of home, just harsh clanging and barked orders in the sacred tongue. "Rise, vessels, the gods hunger." Sleep had been brief, maybe 3 hours on the stone slab. Now they stood in a line, while priests inspected them like cattle. One boy swayed on his feet, exhaustion already taking hold. A priest struck him with a reed switch. "Weakness offends heaven," the priest hissed. Again. They repeated the morning ritual, then again, and again. Each time someone faltered, all 8 boys started over. By the 10th repetition, Shamash-Idi's legs shook and his throat burned from chanting. But this was just the beginning. The days blurred together in a haze of deprivation and ritual. They were kept constantly moving. Prayers, purifications, lessons in the ancient tongue, more prayers. When exhaustion threatened to claim them, the priests had methods to keep them conscious. Cold water, loud drums, sharp reeds across the shoulders. 6 days without sleep, and the walls began to breathe. Shamash-Idi watched the stone ripple like water, saw faces in the shadows that whispered secrets in languages that had died before Babylon was born. One boy, he'd said his name was Nabu Shalim before they took it, started laughing during evening prayers, not with joy, but with the broken sound of a mind finally snapping. He laughed and laughed until blood ran from his nose, until his voice gave out, until the priests dragged him away. When morning came, there were only 7 of them left. "Where did he go?" Shamash-Idi dared to ask. The priest's mask turned toward him slowly. "Who?" "The boy who—" "There are 7 vessels. There have always been 7 vessels." But Shamash-Idi remembered. Even as exhaustion ate at his mind, he clung to the memory. 8 boys, then 7. How many more would disappear before this ended? They learned what broke each boy fastest. For one, it was darkness. They locked him in a pitch-black chamber until his screams echoed through the temple. For another, water. They held him under until he stopped struggling, then pulled him up just before death claimed him. Again and again. For Shamash-Idi, they discovered his breaking point by accident. During the 7th night of sleep deprivation, they brought out a box of personal effects taken from the boys. Objects to be burned, they said. Final ties to their past lives. Shamash-Idi watched numbly as childhood toys and family keepsakes went into the flames. Then he saw it. A small wooden bird, carved by clumsy hands. His younger sister's favourite toy, the one she'd been clutching when the priests came. "No," he whispered. Then louder. "No." He lunged for the fire, desperate to save this last piece of home. The priests held him back, but something had cracked inside him. He fought with strength born of desperation, actually managing to knock one priest down before they subdued him. That's when the real training began. They put him in the silence chamber after that, a stone box barely large enough to sit in, where sound itself seemed to die. Hours passed. Days, maybe. Without light or sound or human contact, the mind begins to devour itself. When they finally released him, Shamash-Idi couldn't speak for 2 days. His voice, when it returned, sounded different, older, broken. The other boys watched him with knowing eyes. They'd all been through their own personal breaking. Each had found the limit of what they could endure, then been pushed beyond it. But something else was happening too. As their individual selves dissolved, a strange bond formed between the remaining boys. They began to move in unison without thinking, finishing each other's sentences in the ancient tongue, sharing dreams of corridors that didn't exist in the waking temple. "We're becoming ready," one boy whispered during a rare moment alone. "Can you feel it? The emptiness growing inside?" Shamash-Idi could feel it, the hollow space where his identity used to be, waiting to be filled with something else, something the priests kept calling their sacred purpose. On the 13th night, exhausted beyond measure, he finally understood what they meant by preparation. They weren't training them for the ritual. They were breaking them down into components, raw material, empty vessels waiting to be filled with something that required the absence of self to take hold. But nothing could prepare him for what he saw when they finally opened the door to the sacred chamber. The bronze instruments hanging on the walls weren't for worship. He could see the dried blood. The sacred chamber existed 3 levels below the main temple, accessed through a door that required 3 different priests to open with 3 different keys. As it swung inward, a wave of cold air escaped, carrying scents that made Shamash-Idi's primitive brain scream warnings. Lotus, myrrh, copper, death. The 7 boys were led inside in single file, heads bowed, red cords bright against their brown robes. What Shamash-Idi glimpsed in his peripheral vision made him grateful for the prohibition against looking up. The chamber was circular, carved from a single piece of black stone that didn't match any rock found near Babylon. The walls curved up into darkness, covered in symbols that predated cuneiform, that seemed to writhe when observed directly, and the instruments. Hooks, blades, restraints, all bronze, all inscribed with prayers, all bearing the stains of use. But it was the pit in the center that drew the eye, 8 feet across, lined with the same black stone, descending into darkness. The air above it shimmered like heat waves, though the chamber was cold enough to see breath. "Behold," the high priest intoned, his mask more elaborate than the others, a chimera of bird and beast and something else, the mouth of Tiamat, the gateway, the hunger that waits. The screams from below meant someone had already begun. Not human screams, at least not anymore. The sound was wrong, filtered through a throat that had been changed, modified, made suitable for producing frequencies that human vocal cords shouldn't achieve. Shamash-Idi's knees buckled, but the boy beside him caught his arm, a tiny gesture of humanity in this inhuman place. The priests began explaining, finally, what the boys were being prepared for, not in comforting metaphors or religious allegory, but in brutal, practical detail. "Every 13 moons the gateway weakens," the high priest said. "What sleeps below stirs, reaching up, seeking passage into our world. It must be fed. Not common blood, it has no taste for the corrupt. Only the pure will satisfy. Only virgin boys, prepared correctly, can hold its attention long enough for the binding rituals to work." That's when he understood what the red cord really meant. Not just a mark of their status, but a leash, a way to lower them down when the time came. The priests showed them the ritual implements. Each had a specific purpose in the preparation of the vessel. The bronze hooks would suspend them at precise angles. The blades would open specific meridians, not to kill, but to allow essence to flow in particular patterns. The restraints would hold them in positions that human anatomy resisted, but that the ritual required. "You will not die," the high priest assured them, though his tone suggested this wasn't mercy. "Death would end your usefulness too quickly. The binding requires a living conduit. Your suffering is the bridge between worlds." One boy, the youngest among them, began to sob. The priests watched impassively. "Tears are good," one noted. "Salt and sorrow, both have power in the binding." They were shown the tablets that would guide the ritual, not the public texts of Marduk and Ishtar, but older writings. Pre-flood knowledge, the priests claimed, from when the gods walked openly and humans knew their true place in the cosmic order. The symbols hurt to read. Looking at them too long caused nosebleeds, temporary blindness, whispers in the skull. But the boys were forced to memorize key passages. Their participation wasn't passive. They would need to speak certain words at certain moments, even as their bodies were utilized. The priests' masks hid more than just their faces. As one leaned close to correct Shamash Idi's pronunciation, he glimpsed the skin beneath, scarred, burned, marked with the same symbols that covered the walls. These weren't just priests. They were survivors of their own ordeals, branded by proximity to whatever lay beneath. "Questions?" the high priest asked, knowing none would dare speak. But one boy, braver or more broken than the rest, raised his hand. "What happens after? When the ritual is complete?" The silence stretched like a living thing. Finally, the high priest responded. "The fortunate ones die. The less fortunate become useful in other ways. The least fortunate discover that consciousness can persist in states that shouldn't allow it." He gestured to the pit. "3 of your predecessors still serve below. Would you like to hear them demonstrate?" The boy shook his head violently. "Wise choice. In 3 days, during the new moon, it would be his turn, and the head priest had already chosen him for something special. He found Ashur in the morning, rocking in the corner, trying to claw his own eyes out. "Can't see them anymore?" Ashur whispered through bloody fingers. "Can't see them if I can't see." The priests dragged him away, and like the others, he simply vanished from their reality. 6 vessels remained. Each boy broke differently under the pressure of knowing what awaited them. The strong ones, the ones who'd seemed most resilient, often shattered most completely when they finally understood there was no escape, no hope, no divine salvation waiting. Shamash Idi watched it happen in real time. These weren't weak children. They'd survived the selection, the breaking, the revelation of the sacred chamber. But knowing exactly how they would suffer, counting down the hours until their turn, that was what finally destroyed minds already pushed to their limits. The first to attempt escape was Nergaldan, a merchant's son who'd retained more of his old cunning than the priests realized. He'd been memorizing the guard rotations, noting which priests carried which keys, planning for days. His moment came during the pre-dawn purification. While the others submitted to the ritual washing, Nergaldan grabbed a bronze bowl and struck the attending priest across the skull. The sound rang through the chamber like a bell. For a heartbeat, freedom seemed possible. The priest fell. Nergaldan ran. The other boys watched with a mixture of hope and terror as he sprinted for the door. The guards found the tunnel, but not before Nergaldan had made it farther than anyone expected. He'd actually reached the upper levels, could see daylight through a window when they brought him down. They made the remaining boys watch what happened next. Not the full punishment that took place in chambers, even the priests spoke of in whispers, but enough. They broke his legs first, carefully, methodically, not enough to kill, just enough to ensure he'd never run again. When they carried out the boy who'd tried to escape, his legs were bent at angles that shouldn't exist, and he was the lucky one. After that, silence became their only rebellion. If they couldn't escape physically, they could at least deny the priests the satisfaction of their screams. 4 boys made a pact, communicated through glances and subtle gestures. They would not speak, not during rituals, not during punishments, not even in their sleep. The priests tried everything: isolation, starvation. They hung one boy by his ankles for 6 hours, waiting for gravity and pain to force words from him. Nothing. The boy's eyes remained fixed on something beyond the stone ceiling, his lips pressed tight. Silence, they learned, was the only safety. Words could be twisted, pleas could be mocked, but silence gave the priests nothing to work with. But even silence couldn't save them from what came next. As the new moon approached, the changes began. It started subtly, boys waking with unexplained bruises, finding their hair falling out in clumps, tasting copper constantly. Then it accelerated. One boy, Shamash Umi, began speaking in tongues during morning prayer. Not the ancient language they'd been taught, but something older, more fundamental. The sounds he made weren't meant for human throats. By evening, his voice had changed completely, dropping 3 octaves and carrying harmonics that made the bronze instruments ring in sympathy. He also developed a taste for lotus petals, not eating them, exactly sucking them, drawing out essence that shouldn't have been there. The priests supplied them willingly, noting his consumption in their tablets. "The gateway recognizes its offerings," one priest observed. "It prepares them according to its needs." Another boy grew scales. Not all at once. First just a patch on his shoulder that looked like dry skin. Then it spread, each scale perfect and iridescent, like a river fish. He spent hours scratching at them until his fingers bled, but they always grew back by morning. The cruelest fate belonged to the boy who simply stopped. One morning he sat down and ceased all voluntary movement. He breathed, his heart beat. He'd swallow if food was placed in his mouth, but his consciousness had retreated so far inside that nothing could reach it. The priests were delighted. Perfect emptiness, they called it, a vessel truly voided of self. They positioned him like a doll during rituals, and he remained however they placed him. Hours later, they'd find him in the exact same position, not even blinking. Still alive, still aware, on some level tears would sometimes roll down his face, but no longer present in any meaningful way. By the night before the new moon, only 3 boys remained who could walk and speak: Shamash, Idi, and 2 others whose names had been so thoroughly erased he couldn't remember them even in his own thoughts. Tomorrow, the high priest announced, the ritual would begin. Tonight, they would prepare the first offering. It started with a pain in his spine, subtle at first, like his bones were trying to remember a different shape. Shamash Idi woke to find his body betraying him in ways that defied understanding. The human form, it seemed, was merely a suggestion when forces beyond the gateway took interest. His spine had developed a curve overnight, not the gentle arch of poor posture, but sharp angles that made lying flat impossible. Magnificent, the attending priest murmured, running fingers along the protruding vertebrae, the cuneiform of heaven writing itself upon your bones. Each morning, the twist in his spine grew worse. What began as discomfort became agony as his skeleton rearranged itself according to patterns that served purposes human anatomy never intended. When he tried to stand straight, lightning shot through his nervous system. When he hunched forward, accepting the deformity, the pain eased to merely unbearable. The other 2 remaining boys suffered their own alterations. One developed joints in places joints shouldn't exist, his forearms bending in 3 sections instead of 1, his neck rotating well past human limits. The other's skin began to thin until you could see the blood vessels beneath, then the organs, then deeper still to structures that shouldn't exist in any living thing. Your bodies prepare for communion, the priests explained with something approaching reverence. What you call deformity is simply efficiency. The ritual requires specific configurations. Your flesh complies. The priests called it becoming sacred, but it felt like dying in slow motion while remaining hideously, perfectly aware. Shamash Idi's legs were next. The strength drained from them over 3 days, muscles withering despite the boys being forced to walk endless circuits of the ritual chamber. First, he needed to lean on walls. Then he crawled. By the 3rd day, his legs were pale stalks that could barely support their own weight, let alone his body. Roots, one priest noted, making marks on a clay tablet. He grows roots for the descent. When he tried to stand, his legs gave way like water. But when the priests dragged him to the edge of the pit and let his legs dangle over the edge, they grew rigid, stretching downward, as if reaching for something in the depths. The pale green tinge appearing on skin came with its own torments. It started at the extremities, fingers, toes, the tip of his nose. Not the green of illness, but something luminescent, as if he was developing his own sickly light source. In darkness he glowed faintly, painting the stone walls with shadows that moved independent of his body. The transformation wasn't limited to the physical. Shamash Idi's perception shifted, showing him layers of reality that human eyes shouldn't process. The solid stone walls became transparent, revealing a honeycomb of chambers and passages. Some held current horrors. Others showed the ghostly impressions of boys who'd come before, still going through the motions of their final days. In one chamber, he saw Nurguldan, the boy who'd tried to escape, still alive if you could call it that. The priests had made good on their promise to find other uses for him. They'd installed him in the wall itself, his twisted form serving as a living conduit for the temple's darker energies. His eyes tracked Shamash Idi through the stone, pleading for a mercy that would never come. The dietary changes were perhaps the most disturbing. Normal food became ash in their mouths. Water tasted of sulfur. But the lotus petals the priests provided soaked in oils from the sacred pit. These they craved with desperate hunger. The petals did more than nourish. They accelerated the transformations, each one eaten, bringing the boys closer to their final forms. "You're ripening," the high priest observed during evening inspection. He examined Shamash-Idi's spine, now twisted into shapes that resembled the sacred symbols on the chamber walls, like fruit for the harvest, sweet suffering to attract what hungers below. The boy with transparent skin went first. His transformation had progressed fastest, perhaps because he'd surrendered to it rather than fighting. By the final night, you could see through him completely, observe his reformed organs pulsing with bioluminescent fluid, watch thoughts travel his neural pathways like shooting stars. The priests declared him ready and began the preparatory rituals. They wound him in copper wire that bit into his translucent flesh, positioned him over the pit, began the chants that would call up what waited below. Shamash-Idi and the other boy watched from their corner, their own bodies too twisted now to do more than observe. The transparent boy didn't scream. His vocal cords had been among the first things to alter, producing only harmonics that made the bronze instruments sing. Something rose from the pit to meet him, not physically. The gateway wasn't open yet, but its attention focused upward, tasting the offering, testing its suitability. The transparent boy's eyes met Shamash-Idi's one last time. In them was the terrible knowledge of what came next, and beneath that, somehow worse, acceptance. The head priest examined his twisted form and smiled. "Perfect," he whispered. "You're finally ready for the festival." Outside the temple, all of Babylon prepared to celebrate renewal inside. He prepared to die. The irony wasn't lost on Shamash-Idi, even as his mind frayed at the edges. Above, citizens hung flower garlands and prepared feast tables for Akitu, the New Year festival celebrating Marduk's victory over chaos. Below, in chambers that officially didn't exist, 3 boys were being prepared as offerings to ensure chaos remained fed and sleeping. The drums had started at dawn, their rhythm carrying through stone and earth to reach even the deep chambers. Each beat seemed to accelerate the transformations. Shamash-Idi's spine cracked and reformed with the percussion, adding new angles that turned his torso into a living glyph of summoning. The transparent boy was gone now, lowered into the pit the night before. Not dead. The screaming that echoed up occasionally confirmed that. Changed. Integrated. Part of whatever system existed in the darkness below, his consciousness preserved to serve functions that human sanity couldn't comprehend. That left Shamash-Idi and one other, the boy with impossible joints, who now moved like a broken marionette, each gesture containing too many articulation points. The vision started 3 days before the festival proper. Shamash-Idi would blink and see things that hadn't happened yet, or perhaps had happened so many times they'd worn grooves in reality itself. He saw himself suspended over the pit, copper wires threading through his transformed flesh. He saw his mouth opening to speak words that would crack the sky. He saw what would rise to meet him, and his mind tried to retreat from the knowledge. But worse were the visions of the past. In fevered dreams, he walked through the memories of boys who'd come before, 13 years of festivals, 13 years of offerings, and he experienced each one. He whispered 12 names, and the priests went pale. These weren't names they'd recorded, weren't boys who officially existed. These were the ones who'd died too early, who'd broken too completely, whose transformations had gone wrong. The failures they'd buried in secret, whose bones even now shifted restlessly in hidden chambers. "He sees too much," one priest muttered. "The gateway is already claiming him." "Good," the high priest responded. "The deeper the connection before the ritual, the stronger the binding." But something was going wrong with Shamash-Idi's transformation. Where the other boys had changed, according to recognizable patterns, becoming things the priests had seen before, recorded in their ancient texts, Shamash-Idi was becoming something new. The green luminescence had spread to cover his entire body, but now it pulsed with its own rhythm, not matching the drums above. His spine had twisted so severely that he resembled a question mark made flesh, but the angle allowed him to see in all directions simultaneously. Most disturbing, he'd begun to speak prophecies in his sleep. Not the vague utterings of exhaustion and pain, but specific predictions. He named the hour rain would begin. He described conversations happening in the palace before they occurred. He whispered of armies approaching from the north, still years away, but inevitable. 3 days before the festival, something went terribly wrong. The boy with impossible joints had been prepared for his descent. The priests had wound him in the ritual configurations, spoken the preliminary words, begun lowering him toward whatever waited below. But halfway down, he began to laugh. Not the broken sound of madness, but genuine mirth, as if he'd understood some cosmic joke. His laughter echoed up from the pit, building on itself, and with each peal, cracks appeared in the chamber's black stone. "Pull him up!" the high priest commanded, but it was too late. The boy's laughter had become something else, a frequency that resonated with the gateway itself. The pit began to breathe, its exhalations carrying scents of spaces between stars. And from below, something laughed back. They lost 6 priests that night. Not to death. Death would have been merciful. They lost them to revelation, to understanding too much too quickly. By morning, those 6 were speaking in perfect unison, their individual personalities erased by whatever truth they'd glimpsed. The festival would have to be accelerated. The gateway was growing unstable, hungry, impatient. The careful 13-moon cycle had been disrupted by the boy's laughter, by Shamash Idi's prophecies, by the accumulated weight of years of secrets and sacrifices. "Tomorrow," the high priest decided, his mask unable to hide the fear in his voice. "Ready or not, we complete the ritual tomorrow." Shamash Idi felt his body responding to the decision. His spine cracked one final time, achieving its ultimate configuration. His legs, useless for walking, stretched and hardened into appendages designed for a single purpose, to anchor him in place, while forces beyond comprehension used him as a conduit. As the festival drums began to beat, his breathing became a rattle. The ritual would have to begin immediately, ready or not. The last thing he heard was the head priest cursing, "He's dying too soon." Shamash Idi's body had decided to surrender before the ritual could claim it properly. His breathing, labored for days, now came in desperate gasps that barely moved his transformed chest. The green luminescence flickered like a failing lamp, and his twisted spine began to unbend as muscles finally gave up their unnatural positions. "No, no, no!" The high priest tore off his mask, revealing a face scarred by proximity to the gateway, one eye white with blindness, skin pulled taut over a skull that had seen too much. "We need him alive for the binding." They tried everything. Sacred oils poured down his throat, only bubbled back up, rejected by a system shutting down. The lotus petals he'd craved now made him retch. Even the copper wires meant to conduct the ritual energies wouldn't hold to his failing flesh. His last breath came just as the sacred words were spoken. The priests had arranged him over the pit, begun the chants that would open the gateway, called upon the hunger below to rise and feed. But as the final syllable left the high priest's lips, Shamash Idi's heart simply stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Then came the sound from below, not the eager stirring they expected, but something like disappointment, like a predator, realizing its prey had died of fear before the hunt could begin. The high priest's mask slipped, revealing pure terror. The ritual required a living conduit. The gateway had been opened, the hunger called forth, but without a living vessel to channel through to bind it. The pit began to vomit darkness. Not shadow, but actual darkness, a substance that ate light, that made the air solid, that carried whispers in languages that predated human speech. It rose like floodwater, and where it touched the bronze instruments, they aged 1,000 years in seconds. "Seal it!" someone screamed. "Seal the gateway!" But the ritual had its own momentum now. 13 years of sacrifices had worn the boundaries thin. 13 festivals of feeding had taught the thing below to expect its meal. And now, cheated of its proper offering, it was coming to collect in person. The head priest grabbed Shamash Idi's corpse, trying desperately to revive it. He pressed on the still chest, breathed into dead lungs, even tried cutting patterns that might restart a stopped heart. Nothing. The boy was gone, and with him, any hope of completing the binding. They had 4 hours before dawn to hide what happened. 4 hours before the festival goers above would expect to hear the ritual bells announcing another successful renewal, another year of prosperity bought with innocent blood. The darkness had filled half the chamber now, and things moved within it. Not quite shapes, more like suggestions of anatomy that shouldn't exist. The younger priests fled, abandoning their posts. The senior ones tried to maintain the chants, but fear made them stumble over syllables, and each mistake made the situation worse. The high priest made a decision born of desperation. If they couldn't complete the ritual, they could at least contain the evidence. He barked orders in the administrative tongue, not the sacred one practical commands for a practical disaster. Burn everything, every scroll, every instrument, every record this ritual ever existed. Collapse the lower chambers, seal every entrance with molten lead. And the body, he looked at Shamash Idi's twisted form, bury it where no one will ever think to look. As they wrapped his body in rough cloth, no one noticed the servant girl watching from the shadows, or the clay tablet she clutched in her hands. She'd been bringing water to the priests, one of dozens of temple servants whose existence barely registered, but she'd heard the screams over the years. She'd seen boys go down into the dark and never return, and tonight she'd witnessed the final failure of a system built on innocent suffering. The tablet in her hands bore a simple message, carved with a kitchen knife in clumsy cuneiform. Below the temple, where they burn the broken gods, a boy died to save us all. His name was Shamash Idi. Remember him. The priests worked through the night, their terror lending them strength. They collapsed tunnels, sealed doors, destroyed 13 years of careful records. The lower chambers were flooded with oil and set ablaze, though the screams that echoed up suggested not everything down there was flammable. By dawn, it was as if the ritual chambers had never existed. The official story was already being crafted. A minor fire in the storage areas, quickly contained, no cause for alarm. The festival would continue as planned. But the gateway, cheated of its meal, robbed of its proper binding, didn't close completely. In the space between spaces, where the ritual had torn reality, something continued to seep through. The darkness they'd released wouldn't stay contained. It would spread, subtle at first, poisoning the roots of Babylon's power, ensuring that an empire built on hidden suffering would suffer in turn. They burned everything, his mat, his clothes, even the incense burner he'd touched, but they couldn't burn the memories. The high priest supervised the destruction personally, his scarred face a mask of barely controlled panic. Every trace of Shamash Idi and the failed ritual had to vanish before the sun rose and the festival began. Babylon's power rested on divine favor, and divine favor required successful rituals. A failure of this magnitude could unravel everything. The boy's transformed corpse presented the biggest problem. They couldn't burn it. The strange alterations to his flesh released toxic smoke that made even hardened priests vomit blood. They couldn't bury it in the sacred grounds. The earth itself rejected the body, spitting it back up like poison. Finally, they carried him to the refuse pit behind the temple, where broken idols and failed sacrifices were discarded. It seemed fitting, in its way. He'd been meant as an offering to prevent catastrophe, and instead had become refuse himself. The ground where they buried him was warm to the touch, as if something below still reached upward, still hungered, still waited. The priests worked quickly, layering him with shattered statues and animal bones, trying to disguise the grave as just another pile of temple waste. But even as they shoveled dirt over his twisted form, strange things began happening. The first priest fell ill before sunrise. He'd been the one to close Shamash Idi's eyes, and now those same eyes haunted his vision. Every time he blinked, he saw that green luminescence, saw the boy's final moment of release. By noon, he was speaking in tongues. By sunset, blood ran from his eyes like tears. The touch of the failed vessel carries consequence, another priest whispered. They'd all handled the body, all participated in the cover-up. How many would fall to this spreading curse? The servant girl moved through the chaos like a ghost, recording everything on her growing collection of tablets. She'd found a hiding spot in the temple walls, a forgotten space where she could work undisturbed. Tablet after tablet, she carved the truth. The priests burn their records, but fire cannot eat truth. 7 boys entered. 1 remains below, still screaming. The gateway stays hungry. The binding failed. He is beneath. That last phrase became her refrain, carved onto a dozen tablets that she scattered throughout the temple complex. Some she hid in the walls. Others she buried near the refuse pit. A few she slipped into the official temple archives, hidden among mundane inventory lists where they might survive unnoticed. Strange sounds began that very night. The temple, which had stood silent for generations, developed a voice. Breathing, the servants called it. The walls breathed. In, out, in, out. As if the entire structure had become a living lung, drawing air down into chambers that no longer officially existed. The high priest ordered the remaining lower chambers, filled with rubble and sealed, but workers reported that the stones they threw down vanished into darkness that had no bottom. Worse, some swore they heard the stones being thrown back up, clattering against walls in passages that should have been collapsed. More priests fell ill. The sickness followed a pattern. Those who'd participated most directly in the failed ritual suffered worst. Skin grew translucent. Spines began to curve. The transformations that had claimed the boys now spread to their tormentors. But without the careful preparation, without the ritual framework, the changes were wild, uncontrolled, agonizing. Within days, every priest who'd touched his body was either dead or mad, and the servant girl had hidden her tablet where she knew it would be found centuries later. She chose her spots carefully: the refuse pit, where foreign soldiers might dig for treasure; the foundation stones, where future builders might find warnings; the archives, where scholars might piece together the truth, each tablet a seed of revelation, waiting for its moment to bloom. Her final tablet was different, longer, more detailed, hidden in a pottery jar, and buried directly above Shamash-Iddi's grave. Here lies a boy who saved Babylon by failing to die properly. The priests sought to feed the darkness with his suffering. Instead, his death at the wrong moment broke their ritual and released what they'd kept bound. The city will fall because of this night. The empire will crumble. But no more boys will die in the chambers below. His name was Shamash-Iddi, son of Marduk-Balassu, brother to little Ishtar who carved wooden birds. Remember him not as a victim, but as the key that locked the gateway by breaking in the lock. When Babylon falls, know it was his freedom that killed it. He is beneath. He is at peace. He is avenged. The cover-up was complete by dawn. The festival proceeded. The citizens celebrated, unaware that below their feet, 13 years of hidden horror had finally ended in catastrophe. But the servant girl's tablets waited, patient as seeds, ready to sprout truth when the empire's grave was finally opened. The breathing behind the walls started soft, but by the third night, even the king could hear it. What began as subtle sounds in the temple quickly spread throughout Babylon like a plague of whispers. Servants in the palace reported walls that sighed. Merchants in the market heard sobbing from beneath their feet. Children woke, screaming about boys, with twisted spines crawling through their dreams. The priests tried to maintain order, but how could they explain what they didn't understand? The failed ritual had torn something fundamental in the spiritual fabric of the city. The gateway, improperly sealed, leaked its influence into every stone, every street, every citizen's sleeping mind. Within a week, the transformations began manifesting in the general population. A baker woke to find his hands fused together in prayer position. The flesh melted and reformed like warm wax. A scribe discovered his spine curving into the same cuneiform shapes that had marked Shamash-Iddi. Children in the temple school began speaking the ancient tongue without being taught, their young voices harmonizing in frequencies that cracked glass. The new boys selected for the ritual all died before reaching the temple, not through violence or illness, but through simple rejection. Their bodies refused the honor. Hearts stopped. Breath ceased. One by one, they fell like flowers touched by frost, and no amount of priestly intervention could force life back into them. The ritual is broken, the high priest admitted in a closed council. The gateway rejects new offerings. It wants what was promised, the specific boy prepared for 13 moons, transformed according to the old patterns. It wants Shamash-Iddi. But Shamash-Iddi was beyond their reach, his twisted corpse rotting in the refuse pit, his spirit freed by premature death. They tried exhuming him, thinking perhaps they could complete the ritual posthumously, but when they dug up his grave, they found only empty cloth and a single clay tablet. He is free. You are not. Even the king's own food began to rot when blessed by these priests. The royal kitchen reported meat turning green, wine becoming blood, bread sprouting luminescent mold. The king, no fool, recognized divine disfavor when it manifested on his dinner table. "What have you done?" he demanded of the high priest. "What sin stains my city?" But the priests couldn't confess without revealing 13 years of hidden atrocities. They spoke of mysterious portents, of divine tests, of anything but the truth, that they'd built their power on the suffering of innocents, and now the bill had come due. The breathing in the walls grew louder. Servants reported seeing boys in the shadows. Not ghosts exactly, but impressions left in reality itself. Always twisted, always young, always watching with eyes that had seen too much. One manifestation was particularly persistent. In the throne room, just behind the king's seat, the outline of a boy appeared in the stone. No matter how many times they plastered over it, painted it, even chiseled out the stone itself, the image returned. A boy bent into impossible angles, hands raised in supplication or warning. The Persians were at the gates, and still the breathing continued. Cyrus's armies surrounded Babylon, but the city's defenders were fighting their own battles within. Soldiers reported weapons that whispered discouragement, walls that bled when struck, gates that opened themselves in the night, as if inviting conquest. The final temple service before the fall was a grotesque parody of ritual. The high priest, his body now showing the same transformations that had claimed the boys, tried to perform the traditional prayers. But every word came out backwards. Every gesture mirrored itself. The sacred flames burned cold and green. In the congregation, worshippers wept as their children spoke prophecies in voices not their own. The 13th moon brings revolution. The empire built on buried boys will bury itself. He is beneath, and he is rising. As Persian soldiers breached the city walls, the last priest of the temple scratched a final message on the wall: "We should have let him rest." The priest's hands shook as he carved each cuneiform symbol. Around him, the temple emptied. His fellow priests fled or fell to madness. The sacred flames guttered out. The idols wept tears of oil. He'd been there that night. He'd held the boy down as they prepared him. He'd chanted the words that twisted flesh and broke minds. He'd helped carry that small, transformed body to its ignoble grave. Now, as Persian boots echoed in the courtyard, as the empire's death rattle shook the walls, he finally understood. They'd thought they were feeding something ancient to keep it sleeping. Instead, they'd been feeding its growth, teaching it to hunger, showing it the flavor of innocent suffering. The last sound he heard before the Persians found him was breathing. In, out, the temple itself drawing breath, waiting to exhale its secrets to new masters. The Persian captain stared at the small skeleton, his mind trying to process what they'd uncovered. The tablets scattered around the body painted a picture of institutional horror that spanned generations. This wasn't just murder. This was systematic, ritualized abuse hidden beneath layers of religious authority. "Gather everything," he ordered his men. "Every tablet, every bone. King Cyrus will want to know what the Babylonians were doing in their holy places." As they excavated the refuse pit, more evidence emerged. Not just one body, but fragments of others. Boys whose transformations had gone wrong, failed vessels discarded like broken pottery. Each small skeleton told its own story of suffering, marked by unnatural curves in the spine, joints bent at impossible angles, bones that showed signs of rapid, agonizing change. The servant girl's tablets provided the narrative thread. Her careful documentation, hidden throughout the temple complex, revealed 13 years of selections, preparations, and rituals. Names of boys taken, dates they disappeared, descriptions of what was done in chambers that no longer existed, sealed and buried, but not forgotten. "He is beneath," the captain read aloud, the phrase appearing again and again. "What does it mean?" An older soldier, one who'd seen enough warfare to recognize evil in all its forms, answered quietly. "It means they buried their shame, but shame has a way of clawing back to the surface." They found the throne room last, where the image of the twisted boy still marked the wall behind the king's seat. No amount of cleaning could remove it. The stone itself had been transformed, carrying the impression like a scar, a permanent reminder of what Babylon had built its power upon. The pattern was sickeningly familiar across history, an institution claiming divine authority, vulnerable children selected for special honor, systematic abuse disguised as ritual necessity, layers of secrecy and threats ensuring silence, and when it all finally collapsed, frantic attempts to destroy evidence and deny everything. But the servant girl's tablets ensured the truth survived. Her careful record, carved in grief and hidden in hope, gave voice to those who'd been silenced. Shamash-Idi and the 12 before him, boys whose names were erased, whose suffering was deemed necessary, whose humanity was sacrificed to feed something that should never have been fed. The Persian Empire would rule where Babylon fell, but they learned from their predecessors' mistakes. The dark chambers stayed sealed. The gateway remained closed. No more boys would be transformed into living conduits for forces beyond human understanding. Yet even now, 2,500 years later, the lessons feel immediate. How power corrupts the sacred, how institutions protect themselves over innocence, how systematic abuse hides behind religious authority, how the vulnerable are silenced while their abusers claim divine mandate. The breathing in the walls of Babylon eventually stopped, but only after the empire fell, only after the priests who'd perpetrated these horrors were themselves consumed by what they'd unleashed, only after the truth, buried beneath layers of lies and rubble, finally found its way to light. Some say if you listen carefully in the ruins of Babylon, you can still hear breathing beneath the stones, waiting for justice that never came. But perhaps that's not quite right. Perhaps what we hear in those ruins isn't waiting but warning. A reminder that whenever power goes unchecked, whenever religious authority shields itself from accountability, whenever the suffering of innocence is deemed acceptable for a greater good, we risk creating our own gateways, our own hungry darknesses that feed on the vulnerable. The servant girl who documented these horrors couldn't save Shamash-Idi. She couldn't stop the ritual or prevent the selection of future victims, but she could ensure their story survived. She could scratch truth into clay and hide it where time would find it. In the end, that's all any of us can do when faced with institutional evil: document, preserve, and ensure the voices of the silenced echo through history. Not for sensation, not for entertainment, but as warning, as witness, as a promise to the vulnerable that their suffering, while it may be hidden, will not be forgotten. He is beneath, but his story rises. Some say if you listen carefully in the ruins of Babylon, you can still hear breathing beneath the stones waiting for justice that never came.